Stories Philippines Podcast.
What sound haunts the quietest corners of a home? What tragedy gives birth not to an angel, but to a demon? Think about the places where secrets are buried, not in the ground, but in the silence between family members, in the fear that makes a whisper feel louder than a scream. We build walls to keep things out, but sometimes the walls are all that hold the horror in. What happens when the fear of judgment is stronger than the love of life itself? I am Paul, and you are listening to Stories Philippines podcast. The air in Manila that February night was thick and close, the kind of heat that doesn't just warm the skin but seems to press on the chest. It was just a few days before Valentine's Day in 2005, a time when the whole city, from the jeepneys packed with lovers to the malls draped in red tinsel, was meant to be humming with romance. But for one young woman, Jocelyn Roldan, the city's pulse felt like a slow, dreadful drumbeat. Jocelyn was 22, a student from a strict, deeply religious family in the Santa Mesa district. Her apartment, a tiny, stuffy rental on the third floor of a crumbling building, was her sanctuary and, now, her prison. The walls were thin, painted a sickly yellow that only seemed to absorb the light. And behind those walls, she was hiding a terrible secret. His verdict was not an act of love to be celebrated. It was a scandal that, if discovered, would shatter her family's reputation and condemn her to a life of shame in their eyes. In the Catholic Philippines, a woman's virtue was a fragile, precious thing, and Jocelyn had broken it. The shame had led her to a desperate, lonely choice in a back alley clinic a few months prior. A decision she now carried like a stone in her stomach, a sigh of deep sadness. She sat bolt upright in her narrow bed, the sound of soft, almost liquid whispering pulling her from a fitful sleep. It wasn't coming from the street. It wasn't the sound of her neighbors. It was coming from the wall behind her dresser, a hollow, dry wall separation from the unit next door that was perpetually cold to the touch. What was that? She thought, her heart hammering against her ribs. It sounded like a child, a very small child, not crying in distress but giggling, a breathy, wheezing sound that held no joy, only a chilling, ancient malice. It was the sound of something small and wrong. Mama, Mama. Jocelyn clapped her hands over her mouth to stifle a scream. The whispering was muffled, like a sound heard underwater, but utterly distinct. It was calling to her. This is where we must peel back the pleasant veneer of romantic holidays and look into the darkness that has always run deep in Filipino belief. The specter haunting Jocelyn's wall has a name, a terrible, pitiful name, the Tiyanak. The Tiyanak is not just a monster for frightening children. It is a creature born of profound tragedy and a severe moral code. In the traditional folklore of the Philippines, particularly in the Tagalog regions, the Tiyanak is the spirit of an unbaptized infant. Think about that for a moment. An infant that dies before receiving the sacrament of baptism is, by this strict theological view, barred from heaven. Their soul is left to wander. But the legend takes a darker, more earthly turn. It teaches that the unbaptized soul of an aborted or illegitimate child, having been denied a proper life and a Christian burial, returns to the world as a vengeful, malevolent creature. It takes the form of a beautiful, harmless baby. It lies in wait in the dark woods, or as we see in Jocelyn's story, in the hidden spaces of human homes. It cries pitifully, its wails drawing in any kind soul who hears it. When the victim picks it up, ready to comfort the seemingly lost infant, the Tiyanak transforms. Its skin turns leathery, its eyes glow with red fury, and its tiny mouth sprouts fangs. It will then bite or claw its victim, draining their life force or simply leading them hopelessly astray to perish. This narrative is a powerful reflection of the cultural anxieties surrounding unwanted pregnancies and the stigma of extramarital relationships in a society where 90% of the population identifies as Catholic. The folklore serves as a grim warning. It is a terrifying consequence attached to the grave sin of abortion or the shame of having an unblessed child. The child in this tale becomes its own eternal avenger against a society that condemned it. The fear of the unbaptized soul is not unique to the Philippines. These cultural beliefs have deep global connections, illustrating a shared ancient fear of the liminal space between life and death. For centuries in European Catholic theology, there was a concept called limbo of infants. It was a state of eternal rest and natural happiness, but without the beatific vision of God, reserved for those who died unbaptized. This was a direct consequence of the doctrine of original sin. While this concept was never formally dogmatized and was largely discarded by the church in the early 2000s after Jocelyn's time, it shows how deeply the fate of these children troubled the minds of theologians for ages. This theological anxiety created the cultural conditions for figures like the Tiyanak to emerge globally. 1. The Banshee of Ireland. While primarily a wailing spirit predicting death, some ancient stories tie the Banshee's cry to the lost souls of those who died suddenly, perhaps before a final blessing. 2. The Chindi in India. These are sometimes understood as the spirits of infants or those who died unnatural deaths, becoming restless and troublesome ghosts. 3. The Vitala in Hindu mythology, a ghost or vampiric entity that possesses corpses, sometimes those of children, for its malicious purposes. But the Tiyanak is unique because of its deceptive innocence. It mimics the very thing society is supposed to protect, a helpless baby, only to betray the rescuer. It weaponizes the instinct to nurture. It's a masterful piece of folklore because it turns empathy into a fatal weakness. Back in the apartment on that dark February, the whispers didn't stop. They became a steady, infuriating presence. Sari na siya kailan ba? Jocelyn began to see the signs of what she now believed was the Tiyanak's haunting. 1. Displaced objects. Her prayer beads would be found on the floor, their strings snapped. A small silver rattle, a gift from a well-meaning relative that she had hidden deep in her closet, would appear on her kitchen table. 2. The smell of decay, a faint, sickly sweet odor began to permeate her tiny apartment, like wilted flowers and spoiled milk, a smell that would fade the moment she tried to locate its source. 3. Small footprints. She woke one morning to find a dusting of fine gray powder, like cement, dust, on her clean floor. In it, leading from the wall to the foot of her bed, were a series of impossibly tiny footprints. Jocelyn, trapped between her guilt and her terror, started to believe the spirit of her unblessed child had not just been lost, but was now vengefully returned to torment her. The baby she couldn't keep was now the monster she couldn't escape. The wall wasn't just a physical barrier anymore, it was the membrane between her world and the realm of her guilt. This sounds like a horrifying personal nightmare, doesn't it? But is it? Is there something more to this than just guilt-fueled hallucination? To a forensic psychologist, Jocelyn's experience fits the classic profile of morning sickness combined with paranoid ideation. 1. Grief and guilt. Her traumatic experience, coupled with the crushing cultural and religious guilt, would naturally lead to profound grief. Unresolved grief often manifests physically. The hallucinations, the whispers, the smell, could be her mind externalizing the horror she feels for her decision. The brain is trying to process an unbearable trauma, and sometimes it creates a terrifying narrative to make sense of the pain. The Tiyanak provides that narrative, a monster, a clear source for her torment. 4. Infrasound. There's also the purely scientific possibility of infrasound. Low-frequency sound waves below the range of human hearing are sometimes created by natural occurrences. Traffic, vibration, wind across a certain architecture, or even perhaps the old rickety air conditioning unit in the hall. These waves can cause physical sensations in humans, disorientation, feelings of being watched, and even, at certain frequencies, visual distortion. Could the whispers simply be the feeling of pressure on the eardrum interpreted by a stressed brain as a voice? But a question remains, one that science can't quite answer. Why the baby? Why the wall? Why the footprints? Why that specific culturally relevant horror? The mind may conjure ghosts, but why does it choose a tiyanak? Let's look at this through a theological lens, moving beyond the strict dogmas of the church and into the realm of spiritual insight. The tiyanak as an entity represents despair. It is a soul that died without grace and returned without love. A first love versus law. The legend of the Tiyanak is a consequence of a religious system that prioritized law over love. It is the cultural residue of a time when the legalistic requirements of the church were by cardinal noto sikulo kusimo naikubing abarititen min. The unwanted, the Tiyanak's existence, is a constant reminder of the societal pressure on women, forcing them to make choices that lead to deep moral anguish. In a way, the Tiyanak isn't just haunting the mother, it's haunting the society that created the impossible choice in the first place. The whispers in Jocelyn's wall are the voice of her guilt, yes, but they are also the spiritual echo of a community's unresolved anxieties about shame, sin, and the fate of the most vulnerable. Now we move to a modern paranormal perspective. Jocelyn eventually confided in her cousin, Elias de la Cruz, a young architecture student who had a keen, if skeptical, interest in local folklore. Elias, practical but worried, decided to treat the haunting like a physical problem. He came to the apartment with a simple toolkit and a borrowed infrared camera, a new tool in paranormal investigations in the mid-2000s. The geographic details, Elias noted that the apartment building was a typical post-war structure in Santa Mesa, built quickly with many false walls and hidden utility shafts. The wall behind Jocelyn's dresser was a drywall partition, added later, likely creating a shallow, sealed-off space of about 6 inches between the unit walls, a perfect hiding spot. A perfect echo chamber. Elias focused the infrared camera on the wall where the whispers came from. The infrared camera detects thermal anomalies, unusual spikes, or drops in temperature. Most of the wall was the same ambient temperature of the room, but there was one spot, about 3 feet off the floor, right where a baby's head might rest, that showed a consistent and inexplicable drop in temperature. As scrutiny kanal kasida notes kel aolesot in oval chefrong ha che namaram. A patch of cold that refused to warm up, an oval shape no bigger than a small dinner plate. Elias also brought a simple electronic voice phenomenon or EVP recorder which simply records ambient sound at a high gain level, hoping to capture sounds the human ear might miss. He left the recorder running for an hour while he and Jocelyn sat in the opposite room. When they played back the recording, after a lot of white noise and street sounds, they heard it, a distinct, short burst of high-frequency static, followed by a sound that made Jocelyn gasp. It was an infant's coo, followed by a sound that was too rough, too guttural for a human child. Elias decided they had to know what was in the wall. Not a ghost, he reasoned, but maybe something structural or grimly something physical that was causing the phenomenon. He used a utility knife and carefully cut a small square of the drywall over the cold spot. What they found was simple, physical, and heartbreaking. Inside the tight 6-inch space of the wall cavity was a nest of old newspapers, torn fabric, and a small, brittle bundle. Elias, wearing gloves, carefully pulled it out. It was an ancient, moth-eaten doll, a baby doll made of hardened rubber from the 1950s or 60s. Its eyes were missing, giving it a hollow, staring look, and its rubber mouth was perpetually open in a silent wail. The cold patch on the wall was where the rubber had degraded, allowing the cold air from the building's unventilated interior to pool. The faint smell of decay was the breakdown of the old rubberized plastic and the mildewed paper. The whispers? That was the air current passing through the tiny cracked hole of the doll's open mouth, an acoustic fluke. The tiny footprints were simply dust, disturbed by a large cockroach path, magnified by Jocelyn's terror. The tiyanak in the wall was a discarded toy. A grieving heart had turned a piece of forgotten trash into a supernatural demon. Jocelyn held the doll in her lap. It was a physical manifestation of her fear. It wasn't the spirit of her child. It was the material proof of her isolation. We are always looking for external proof of the paranormal, but sometimes the most powerful haunting is the one created by our own minds, shaped by centuries of cultural fear and religious pressure. Jocelyn had been tormented not by a spirit, but by the weight of her secret. And the Tiyanak folklore had simply provided the language for her trauma. If you're out there and you're carrying a story that feels too heavy, too strange to share, submit your stories to our email, stories@podcast@gmail.com. You never know what kind of release a little light and air can bring to your own whispers in the wall. Jocelyn eventually moved away from Santa Mesa. She found solace not in the church's strict doctrine, but in the quiet act of sharing her story. The haunting stopped the moment the doll was removed, the moment her secret was aired out. But the question remains, did the physical presence of the doll truly create the phenomena, or was it the cultural expectation of the tiyanak that gave it life? Did the folklore itself act like a template, a self-fulfilling prophecy for a woman in an impossible situation? The tiyanak tells us that not all lost souls become angels. Sometimes, out of shame and despair, they become monsters that prey on our compassion. But perhaps the truest, darkest whisper is not the sound of a demon baby, but the quiet, agonizing realization that our own deepest fears are what give the demons their power. Thank you for tuning in to this week's dive into the dark corners of the Philippines. For more unsettling details about the tiyanak and the history of the limbo of infants, find show notes and support options in the description below. Also, you can access exclusive content on Patreon where we delve into the lost episodes of Filipino dark history, and make sure to follow us on social media for daily folklore facts. Until next time when we ask, what is the true cost of silence? Like, subscribe, follow, and share this podcast. You can support the podcast financially in ways you can find in the show notes. Good night, and may your walls remain quiet.